How did you find the courage to do such a thing? Because like you were basically working for so long, so you've seen you like that kind of real form. How did you like courage to start like dressing? Like I've actually been I'm gender queer and I've had a really hard
You know, it is very scary because you don't know what the reaction is going to be. Even with people I worked with for 10 years, it's just, it was something I had to do, and I just made up my mind I'm going to do it regardless of what happens. And I kind of had a fallback because having been with the city for 30 years, if things completely fell apart and turned to crap, I could just bail out. So, so it wasn't like I was beginning my career. And for somebody who is beginning their career, it's a much more sticky situation. But it was, I've never been somebody to shy away from things, and that's just who I am.
When you say that your family decided to stay with you, do you mean that your wife decided to stay with you like as a partner, or they, just accepted you?
My wife stayed with me as my partner, as my friend. The nature of our relationship just is changed in subtle ways. And it was very, very difficult for her. It was touch and go for quite a while. And I actually had decided early on that I could accept losing her as the cost of being true to myself. I had kind of made up my mind that that was a real possibility. And as it turned out, she was much more accepting than I had actually thought she would be. The person I actually feared losing more was the love of my son, who was 17 at the time that I told him. But he's been remarkable too.
Since day one, or was it really difficult?
Since day one.
I was going to say, Carolyn, you had mentioned being an ambassador once you made your transition. What about the importance of members of the heterosexual community stepping up and being ambassadors? Because I know I've had many discussions with Professor Hicks. We've talked about a lot of different topics, and this being one of them, about like how the double bind works and how those of us who are heterosexual are the ones who are persecuting people from the transgender community and the homosexual community. And so it's really, the onus is on us to change our behavior and our perceptions. So what about the importance of us stepping up as ambassadors?
I think that's a wonderful point, and I really salute you for having that kind of attitude. And yeah, I think there is a role for people to play, because somebody may not express to me or to Drian how they feel about trans people because they don't want to piss us off, right? But they might tell you or somebody that you're with, and that's where you can step up and say, you know what, that's wrong. And I know trans people, and they're not like that. They're not freaks. They're not weird. They're just people. And that's the role for you to play, is to step up and do the right thing and to say the right thing, even when it's uncomfortable to do.
Actually, I also would like to respond to that a little bit, and that is that I don't see the heterosexual white man as the aggressor purely. I see all of us as victims of discrimination, all of us as victims of hate. We've all got something about us that we're insecure about, something that makes us different, something that has enticed scorn from other people in our lives. And I think when we allow other people to be marginalized by those thoughtless, bigoted jokes, we are creating an environment in which we can also be marginalized for our differences as well. So I would say that the heterosexual community, the man, if you will, needs to stand up and be an advocate, not just because you see a need and you want to fill it, but for yourselves as well. This is a fight for each one of us.
Do you have any other questions, comments, and concerns?
Having been a part of the gay and lesbian community for so long, it's amazing to me watching just the ability to have the panel discussion where we are now in 2012 from friends of mine who had transitioned, in the 80s, and I remember when we didn't have T, it was the LG community. First it was the gay community, then the invisible lesbian got in there for a little bit, and we had this big argument over bi, and we were really, really reluctant, and this is through the center and everything else, very reluctant to put that T in there. And I remember working with some of the very early trans groups through the center, and the absolute lack of support, the really hiding in the closet in a way that gay and lesbian community identify as such wasn't having to do in the same way anymore. So watching the progression as you guys talk and thinking about friends of mine some years ago, what they went through is really, being old enough, having been over 31 too, having the experience of watching the history unfold is really very pleasurable to see academically and personally, watching it. It's changed. It's hard to keep in perspective sometimes the fact that we do make what is still feeling like incremental steps, but when you remember where you were 25 years ago, there's really been a really large step that's been made, so.
I definitely recognize that I stand on the shoulders of a lot of giants, and it's not just to get a better view.
No, amazing people that.
How do you feel that the media portrays transgender individuals, and do they affect change in a positive, negative, or neutral way?
Well, I think it depends on what you look at. Like, there was that, I think it was on ABC, that show Work It, about heterosexually identified men who were dressing as women to get jobs because they were working at an all-female firm and that was the only place they could get a job. And so the punchline was about trans people who are early in transition who maybe get clocked, if you will. They're read as trans rather than what they're presenting as. And that was the punchline of all the jokes, masculine women standing at the urinals, things of that nature. So things like that are not great. But then, for example, you look at Logo and you look at like RuPaul's Drag Race. It really is clarifying, what is a drag identity versus a trans identity, and the diversity that exists within those two, and how blurry those lines are getting between people who cross-dress for pleasure, who cross-dress for performance, who cross-dress for an income, and people who live that existence. So I think it depends on where you're looking at. So, there's good and bad out there. It's about where you focus your energy.
A question for Grant. How do you feel about transgender people playing the part of transgender individuals in like Hollywood and television?
I think it's time for trans people to be out and to be seen. And I think when you look at movies like Gun Hill Road, that actually did use a trans woman to talk about the dangers of transitioning, such as pumping silicone and things like that. I thought that was an amazing movie. But then also you look at things like Trans America, where it was a cisgendered woman playing a trans woman, but that was really well done as well. So, I think it's important to see trans people portraying trans people, and hopefully that's a trend that will continue. And if they do have non or cisgendered actors playing trans people, then to do a great job, such as in, Trans America and things like that.
Sorry, this may have been addressed. I had to step out for class, but from a philosophical point of view, I think this is so insulting. It seems to me the point, philosophically speaking, is to transcend gender roles or even falsify gender roles. But do you think perhaps an argument could be made that some trans individuals going from male to female by changing their attitudes and dress and could be in fact enforcing gender roles by taking on those society type roles?
You know, I think it's really interesting. The Transgender Law Center did a study and looked at the incomes of transgender people pre and post transition. So, for example, for trans women who existed as men in the workplace who then transitioned to female, oftentimes trans women lost their jobs, were unable to get the same position, and were unable to get the same salaries that they did as men. Trans men who existed in the workplace as female and transitioned to men were often promoted, were often given higher salaries because they joined the good old boys club. They were now able to join the water cooler conversations. They were now able to go out to the bars with the guys and what have you do guy things. So yes, sometimes trans people are able to access some sort of power or validation through living up to those stereotypes, unfortunately.
Back to the question that was posed a moment ago, would it be more important to see transgender people portrayed by transgender people, or just to see transgender people portrayed, period, like anybody else in a movie? You see regular people every day, just like there would be transgender person, just a regular person. So is it more important to put the emphasis on a transgender person portrayed by a transgender person, or just to have the setting in Hollywood be where a transgender person is just the same as if there was a Hispanic person or a white person or a male or a female or whatever it was, just to have transgender people portrayed?
I think I've often felt the same way. And what I would love to see is trans people given roles that have nothing whatsoever to do with their being trans. Because we are just like everybody else. We fill every imaginable role in society. I know trans women who are truck drivers. I know a trans woman who was a NASA engineer. They're doctors, lawyers, anything you can think of. Trans people are in that role, and I don't think it's necessary to always portray trans people as being either murder victims, murder suspects, or something odd, because that's not reality.
Yeah, I think if I can go on a little bit, what's really important, at least for me as a philosopher, is the idea, this hope that we can kind of move beyond gender concepts and forcing categories onto people that, so even if we were able to do this, and I think you're trying to get to this before, yes, there's going to be people that might act, say, more feminine or more masculine or whatever. But the problem, I think, is saying you have to act feminine, you have to act masculine. These are the masculine traits by which you must act. These are the feminine traits by which you must act. And if you fail to do this, we are going to take you out of society, whether as a murder victim, which is often done, or you're not going to get a job, you're not going to get housing, you're not going to get this, you're not going to get that. And ideally, we would just be able to move beyond this need to categorize everybody into these kind of concepts, because people just don't fit that neatly in concepts, right? So.
We got it.
Okay, give me a second, because my words are all here. But I'd like to thank you guys for bringing up the concepts of, the gender roles and the gender behavior, because one of the things that I notice as a genderqueer person is that even as genderqueer people, we're often forced, having abandoned the typical female gender roles that I grew up with that were forced on me as a child. I'm still forced, I still feel there's still a lot of social pressure to, oh great, now I have to like trucks, sports, wrestling, all of the things that society expects of men, they expect doubly, triply, quadruply of trans men. And I think because there's also the desire to be in, as a young trans person with a whole career ahead of me, I often have the desire to be invisible, to be in my classes without everyone else realizing that I was born a girl. Not that that was several years ago, but I've been on Pierce campus for 5 years now. The first 3 years, I was very much in the back of the classroom, very much trying to avoid notice because I didn't want someone to know I was trans. Because I didn't want my employer to know I was trans because I was hired as male. And so I just, I've got to go because my ride is here, but I'd like to thank all of you. And so thank you.
Not so much a question, but more commentary. First off, I'd like to thank both Drian and Carolyn, because you both affected me personally. Drian by running team and helping me. Just last week, I got my documents all recorded. So, Carolyn, for when I first kind of stepped out into the introverse and found Laura, as you were one of the people that kind of guided me and helped me, gave me advice. So thank you very much. But even more importantly, what I'd like to mention is, Doctor, what you mentioned about your studies and the microaggressions and how important it is, especially in the college environment. I came out last September, and I only really came out full time this February when the school semester started. I'm still going to community college, and the experience was somewhat mixed. I did so somewhat with the help of one of the professors, and another professor gave me an opportunity to give a presentation, sort of a seminar on what it is to be trans, what it is to kind of live our daily lives, not the things that people usually think about, regarding hormones and surgeries and so forth, but just going to the right bathroom or not, or just walking out in certain clothing and you think, that person look at me because they think I'm attractive or because they just figured it out. And it was a very interesting experience, and it's actually catapulted me to become much more active in the community. And now I'm part of the GSA, both at my current school and at Cal State Northridge, and applying for there's a new LGBTI resource center opening this fall at Northridge, first of its kind, and applying there as a peer mentor and being involved in the community. And my main point being, I'm going to stop there, but is that it's so important to be involved in the community, and so important to build relationships with you guys as allies. I cannot even begin to tell you how great it feels to walk onto a campus like today, walk into a room and not be looked at as who's that freak, but hey, it's just her. So, thank you.
Remind me of Rose from Titanic.
And you just made me.
I hope I'm not making it too silly, hypothetical, but since gender roles can be seen to be subjective or in fact invalid entirely, would it mean anything if I, as a heterosexual male, just said I identify as a woman without changing my outward appearance? Would that mean anything at all?
Well, I think the thing to understand is that transition is different for everyone. So part of that spectrum is meeting somebody who will identify as trans, who you look at and let's say you see masculine features, you see what you would perceive a masculine body, but you speak to them and they tell you, well, I identify as female, I'm no ho, no op, no hormones, no operations. So that identity exists, and again, it's about validating that person's identity, not saying you don't fit into the box that I perceive you to be in, but rather saying, okay, I accept you as you are for who you are, and I will validate your pronouns, your names, your what have you.
I would actually argue that I wouldn't say that a gender role is valid or it's not useful. As humans, we categorize. That's how we make split decisions. We have to act, we have to think, and we have to function in this world. So we have to stereotype. That's natural. What I don't think is natural, what I don't think is necessary, is to stay within those stereotypes, not be able to think outside of them. So I think it's very useful for me to look at you and think male. That's fine. That gives me all kinds of information that'll allow me to function in the world. But I also think it's useful for me to be open to you when you say actually identify as female. And I think that's the difference. I need to be able to see you as the person that you identify as. It's not my role, it's not my place to tell you who you are, to tell you how you identify. And I need to be able to hear how other people see themselves and alter my point of view based on that information.
If I can make one other comment, I think context is extremely important. When I first started my journey and I began seeing a gender therapist, I had to go to her office directly from work, and so I was in a suit and a tie, and short hair. But she accepted me as